Welcome to this short little lecture that is basically an overview of digestion, absorption, and transportation. There's also a lecture that's on that goes into much more detail on digestion. So this, you'll notice, will focus a little bit more on absorption and transportation. But following this lecture, there are 3 lectures for carbohydrate, digestion, absorption, and transportation, and then one similar for lipids and one for protein. So we'll go through each macronutrient in its own presentation. So reviewing the hormones of digestion, gastrin, secretin, cholecystokinin, and gastric inhibitory peptide. This page doesn't actually show you what, I don't think it shows you what each hormone does, but it tells you where it's made and where it acts, where its action is. So remembering that in a lot of cases, hormones are made in one site, but then act on a different organ. So please check back to the total slideshow on digestion to review what the action of these hormones is or are. So then just a little connection between the central nervous system and our digestive tract. So we talked about in the previous presentation peristalsis, this sequential contraction of the ringed muscles that we see not only in the esophagus but also in the stomach and the intestines. So this action is actually controlled by our central nervous system. So any disconnect between the central nervous system and the digestive system would result in some sort of issue with peristalsis and the ability of our bodies to move food through the digestive tract. On the stomach, we have stretch and density receptors. And these literally are connected to the nervous system, central nervous system, and they literally respond to remember we said the stomach can be as small as 3/4 of a cup or as large as a gallon, roughly. So as the stomach becomes more and more stretched, and the density receptors too, so as it becomes stretched and also filled up, these receptors will send nerve signals to the hypothalamus. Usually as they become stretched and filled up, the signal is, okay, we're full, we can't fit anymore, we're at capacity, please stop eating. And similarly on the other side, if we haven't eaten for 12 or 24 hours or whatever, when we feel hungry, that's because that stomach has decreased now to such a small size that these stretch and density receptors are saying, okay, we're super empty, we're not stretched at all, we're hungry, please feed us. And then stimuli too, like all of our senses, so smelling food, seeing food, tasting food, touching food even, these can all trigger the central nervous system to start stimulating the salivary saliva production in the mouth. And then just going through the small intestine in a little bit more detail how things are absorbed, because as we go through carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, you'll notice we'll talk a lot about the mucosal membrane, the enterocytes, and these villi where the capillaries and lacteals are housed. So the enterocytes are really pretty crucial here, and actually you'll notice in the subsequent presentations that some digestion is actually still happening inside of the enterocytes. The enterocytes are these cells that basically line the inside of the small intestine. And I'm just going to slide because this will show you a little fuzzy, but it'll show you what we're talking about. So inside the small intestine, we have these really large folds. So here you see is inside the canal of the small intestine. So you see these circular folds. And these large folds we call villi, and then on the edge of all these folds we have what we call microvilli, so even smaller little folds. And on the microvilli are where we see the epithelial cells. And so food will pass through, sometimes we call the microvilli the brush border as well, it's definitely like the border of the inside of the small intestine. The nutrients or the products of digestion will be absorbed into epithelial cells, and then from those epithelial cells entering into either the lacteals, the lymph system, sorry, that's the blue, or entering into the blood, the capillaries. So here's your intestinal wall, the villi fold. Here's the big blow up of the villi fold, and again, unfortunately, on the next page too. So again, you'll just see the large villi fold, and some of these words we'll go through in subsequent lectures. But you see the blood vessel, you see the lacteals. Arteriole is like truly that ending of the capillary. Yeah, so just showing, and lymph is typically where products of fat are absorbed. It's also where we see our immune cells, but eventually products of fat digestion will move into the blood. All right, and then just reviewing this a little bit too, that we absorb from into those enterocytes in a few different ways. We absorb nutrients, and from the enterocytes into the blood or into the lymph, we have a few different methods of absorption as well. So passive diffusion, facilitated diffusion, active transport, and endocytosis. Passive diffusion literally just passes down a gradient, so from area of high concentration to area of low concentration. So especially for things like water and our electrolytes, they will move, if the body needs water or needs sodium or chloride or potassium, meaning we're deficient inside of our cells, inside of our blood, and we consume through food or beverage, water, potassium, sodium, chloride, whatever, then those will move down the concentration gradient through passive diffusion. Facilitated diffusion is still going down a concentration gradient. Fructose is an example of a nutrient that we absorb down a concentration gradient, but using a protein molecule to help with that transport. Active transport is where we actually require energy plus a carrier protein. Often it's not always against the concentration gradient, but often it can be. And this is where we'll see a lot of absorption of nutrients is via active transport. So particularly our glucose and our galactose require a carrier protein as well as energy to be absorbed. Same with amino acids. And then endocytosis is where the enterocyte actually engulfs the nutrient or the molecule. And we see endocytosis particularly in infants drinking mother's breast milk with antibodies. Those antibodies actually would just be engulfed and then absorbed into the enterocyte. So here's the schematic of passive transport, facilitated diffusion, and active transport. You'll see diffusion and facilitated diffusion, like I said, are down the concentration gradient. So inside the small intestine, we have, this is actually probably looking at a particular cell. So moving maybe from the blood supply into the cell, it will go down the concentration gradient. Facilitated diffusion, remember, requires a carrier protein, and then active transport is where it might go against the concentration gradient. So from area of low concentration to an area where concentration is already a bit high. And that also requires work to make that happen. Work in the form of ATP or energy. So just a quick look at how fructose, glucose, and galactose are absorbed differently. So the enterocytes, right, that cell that lines the small intestine, and over here we're inside the inside of the intestine, and this is the other side of the enterocyte, which is moving into that capillary. So glucose and galactose will move. SGLT is actually the carrier protein that will move glucose and galactose, again, typically against the concentration gradient into the enterocyte. Fructose moves by just facilitated diffusion, but requiring a different transport carrier protein. And then again, from the enterocyte into the blood, we still require a carrier protein to make that happen. As well as this is where we're seeing that change of energy happening. So using an ATP to allow this transfer to happen. And then transportation. So once we're into the bloodstream or the lymph system, we move things along. So to different sites of the body. So the cardiovascular system is our blood. Products of digestion that are transported via the cardiovascular system are oxygen, carbon dioxide, water, and water-soluble nutrients. Typically from the gastrointestinal tract, the capillaries will shuttle the contents of digestion to the portal vein, which delivers them then to the liver. The liver then basically receives the end products of digestion, either to convert to something to be stored or to convert to something to be excreted through the kidneys, or delivery to other organs in the body for use. And then the lymph system is where we see immune cells and fats or fat-soluble nutrients will be absorbed into the lymph system and then moved into the blood.